Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session here at Room for Discussion. Today, more than half of our planet's population lives in urban areas, and this proportion is projected to only grow over time. This further increases the importance of the city. Throughout the majority of history, cities were a place of death and disease, a place that economists couldn't figure out how to deal with. However, our guest of today has shifted this paradigm, researching the role of cities over several decades and looking how it fosters human achievement. Professor Edward Glaeser has found that cities do not only make us richer, but also happier, healthier, greener, and smarter. Now, normally this would be the time during the introduction speech that would start listing the accomplishments of our guest, but I'm afraid that wouldn't leave us much time for the interview. Edward Glaeser is Fred and Eleanor Professor at Harvard University at the Department of Economics. And one does not become professor at Harvard University without a CV that can be published as a book itself. Having released over 100 articles and 10 books, it is an honor to have such an acclaimed academic at our stage today. Before we start off with the interview, on an organizational note, the interview will be conducted by my wonderful colleague, Kari, and I. There will be an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions during the interview. We will indicate when this time is there, and then just raise your hand, and Linus will come to you with the public microphone. Now, without much further ado, please give a warm round of applause to our guest, Professor Edward Glaeser.
Hi, Pierre. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathy. Hi.
Welcome at our university, Professor Glaeser.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
This isn't the first time that you visited Amsterdam. What do you like about the city?
Oh, it's not just that I've been coming to Amsterdam for 32 years. Can that possibly be right? Can I possibly be that old? Yes, for 32 years since 1986. And Amsterdam is just a glorious city in many ways, especially when sort of the sun manages to creep out and from beyond the crowds. But you know, there's a sense in which I sort of feel Amsterdam as my own sort of spiritual home. I grew up in New York City, and my school was a Dutch school, founded in 1624. So you know, and our school teams were all called the Dutchmen, and we had a keen sense of our debt to the values of the golden age of Amsterdam, to the values that were about freedom and trade and exchange and exploration and finding new opportunities. And those are our values, I think, that are very much still with us in Amsterdam. Obviously, the restaurant scene is great here. The artistic legacy is phenomenal. The canals can be quite beautiful. So it's wonderful to be here.
And you already said that you grew up in a city yourself. You grew up in New York, but you grew up during the 1970s in a very tumultuous time. Do you think that this also made you get interested in urban economics as well?
Oh, for sure, right? So I grew up during a period where cities seemed anything but triumphant, right? The New York, when I was born in 1967, was vastly safer than it was 10 years later. And I lived in a world in which the area in which you could walk safely seemed to be receding into a smaller and smaller area. So it really felt as if, the civilization that cities had created had then left the cities. I also lived through, as a kid, the near bankruptcy of New York, the famous New York Daily News headline, President Ford to city drop dead, right? And it really was an enormously disturbing time period to live through. And then all of a sudden in the 1980s, the sun came out again, and cities seemed to be enjoying a renaissance. And I think it was hard not to be fascinated by that, not to be fascinated by the extent to which cities have changed over time. And I think that's certainly played a huge role in making me interested in understanding how cities work.
Apart from the role that New York in the 1970s played, what else fueled your interest in economics, and specifically urban economics?
I think there are lots of different ways that I got to urban economics, one of which was being interested in cities. And I think one point I think that I want to stress is that if you grow up in an American suburb, and I assume that there are Dutch suburbs like this as well, you can grow up in a world in which you see remarkably few of the downsides of life. one of the great things about cities is that they force you to see both wealth and poverty. They force you to see the range of human experiences. And I think that was an enormously important part of my youth, was the sort of recognition that I was lucky, not as lucky as any of the hyper-rich, but I lived in a safe, comfortable place. But for the roll of the dice, I could have been a kid growing up in a project. And understanding that was sort of really important for me. Two other reasons how I got to this interested in cities. So one of which is I have two parents who, in some sense, the marriage of their interests becomes urban economics. So my father was an architectural historian, a curator in architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art. So he had a great interest in the built environment and sometimes in city planning as well. My mother was an MBA who ran capital markets for Mobil Oil. So in some sense, if you put a woman who runs capital markets for an oil company together with a guy who studies architecture and design, you get an urban economist, and that's what I am.
But would you say that due to your father, you think that the aesthetics of a city is also important?
Sure, I do, although I also ended up with a keen understanding of my own lack of aesthetic judgment. So
Did this lead to fierce debate at the Christmas table?
No, because not at all. The values of the economist and the architect are too hard to make compatible. So it's best for economists to just learn from architects and not try to convince them of things. After all, the starting point of architects is they believe it is an outrage that the client who pays for their building has any right to say anything about what it looks like. Okay, which is just too hard for economists to actually make that leap in terms of them.
Before exploring cities and their role in today's society, we'd first like to establish what a city is. Now, the official criteria for a city in, for instance, the UK is that it's home to at least 300,000 residents, it is a distinct identity of a wider area, and it has a good record of local government. Do you agree with these criteria?
For administrative purposes, you can define anything any way you like it. I think, to me at least, urbanism, urbanity's cityness, it's more continuous. It's not as if you suddenly become urban once you cross over a boundary and then become unurban. And for many people, we live lives that are partially urban and partially something else, right? For me, a city is just an abundance of people in a limited amount of space. Cities at their heart are just the absence of physical space between people. They are density, proximity, closeness. And you get that in many different ways. And for many people, you may work in downtown Manhattan and be in an incredible maelstrom of human activity, but then go and sleep in some totally different setting. So, I think understanding the different ways in which people experience urbanism is important.
If cities are the absence of physical space, to what extent do cities like Los Angeles, which are car-built and there's a lot of physical space there, to what extent do they also fall under this definition?
It's a car-based city. It's just, in some sense, a little bit less urban, right? I mean, it's not that it ceases to be a city. I mean, Los Angeles also obviously is huge, but it's a little bit less urban than living in a hyper-dense walking area.
At the beginning of the 20th century, we talked about the demons of the city, and many experts said that cities were obsolete and dinosaur and livable. However, you now are advocating the triumph of the city. So what happened throughout the 20th century?
So in some sense, the growth and decline of cities reflects a great sort of series of tectonic technological shifts. Okay? Some technological shifts are centripetal. They move us together, and some technological shifts are centrifugal. They push people apart. Many of the important shifts in the 19th century were centripetal. So, for example, the 19th century brought us public transportation. Originally horse-drawn omnibuses on the streets of London and Paris, and then railways that enabled the cities to go up. The skyscraper, right? The skyscraper being just a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton for the building, and then transportation done by elevator. Like so many other innovations, the skyscraper is a marriage of two different ideas, right? These are all centripetal technologies. They enabled cities to grow. The 20th century was centrifugal. Most importantly, the automobile, right, enabled people to move in far-flung areas. But think about televisions, think about radios. These are all technologies that brought the pleasures of the city into rural homes, right? All of them enabled dispersals. Now, what's interesting is this sort of centrifugal world seemed to start reversing in the 1980s. And I think the biggest thing that happened was, over the last 50 years, and it's, Thomas Piketty is behind us. It's part of the background for inequality is that there was a tremendous increase in the returns to skill, a tremendous increase in the returns to being smart, being lucky too, but being smart in particular. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people, right? All of you are here in Amsterdam, right? All of you have chosen the experience of being in the midst of a city and being in the midst of a university, which is sort of a city itself. And it's a place where you get smart by being around other smart people. I will say to you students, right, the important things that you learn at universities are not things that your professors teach you. At best, right, we get to call the subject material, right? But then you educate each other. You teach each other both by working and by hopefully working together collaboratively, right? The more complicated the world is, the easier it is for ideas to get lost in translation, and the more important face-to-face contact becomes. I mean, anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material, it's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your students, right? Face-to-face contact makes that workable. And this rise in returns to skill was the big reverse that caused cities to come back. And it's why, cities have managed to reemerge, and everything else is sort of built upon that.
Where a lot of American cities found their success, others arguably failed. For instance, if we look at Detroit, we see that the population over the past several decades shrank by 58%. What has caused this failure?
So the gap in the US is really explained quite well by skills. Human capital is the bedrock on which urban, national, and individual success rests. And about 13% of Detroit's adults have a college degree, as opposed to over 50% of Seattle's adults that have a college degree. Both of those cities are doing just as well as you would expect their human capital bases to be. In Detroit's case, Detroit was fabulously productive as an industrial city in the middle of the 20th century, probably the most productive place on the planet in 1950. And because it was so easy for anyone to get a job working on an assembly line, no one saw the value of higher education, and the city certainly didn't. So that left it very vulnerable when the automobile companies left. It left it with very little ability to reinvent itself. Whereas, it's easy to forget now, but in 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle, asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights, right? Because Boeing had been cutting back on the number of jobs. And just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller GM, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. It's before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, before Starbucks. All of those companies reinvented themselves, and they wouldn't have been started since then, and they wouldn't have started in Seattle if Seattle hadn't been so well educated. Right? Education plays a role in all of those cities. And indeed, it's easy to think, if cities are about making us smart by being around other smart people, then starting with a base of education is really crucial, because having educated people around you mean that you have more people who have something that's worth telling you. And don't forget, a lot of your education is actually learning how to learn from other people, learning how to teach other people, learning how to communicate with other people as well.
Okay, but can you say that the monoculture of Detroit made them fail?
Yeah, it's bad.
Okay,
monoculture is bad.
Because we have a city in Germany called Wolfsburg that is focused also on Volkswagen only. Do you think that they risk the same fate?
I think monoculture everywhere is a risk. And certainly if you look at you want extreme versions of this, look at Norilsk in Russia, right? I mean, the former Stalinist steel towns, which are, disastrous at reinventing themselves. They're also really tough climates, which is also part of the Detroit problem. But, think about if cities succeed by bringing different ideas together, then having a monoculture is the worst possible situation you have, because you can't draw on multiple ideas. The other thing that's really important about these monocultures is part of human capital is stuff that you learn in schools, but a lot of the most important of it is the stuff you learn on city streets. And there's no more important talent for the long-run success of a city than the ability and inclination to be an entrepreneur, to start your own business, right? Monocultures kill entrepreneurship. They don't engender it. I mean, what you want is lots of little firms, lots of facility for startups in lots of different industries. And that's the sort of, burbling feeding ground for urban reinvention.
Thank you. Are there any audience questions so far? Over there, I see one.
Mr. Here?
Hi. Do you think there is a optimal population for a city? If you think so, what is the number?
I will give neither an optimal population nor even an optimal population density, which is a slightly different issue. The reason is that people have different tastes. right? I mean, I'm an economist. I'm not an architect. And part of the difference between economists and architects is that economists don't think there should be one way of living, right? So there are some people who think that living at, 250 people per hectare is great. There's some people who can't imagine anything more horrible than living in such crowds, right? I mean, as long as there's heterogeneity in taste, as long as different people like different things, there should be some big cities and some small cities. Successful cities themselves are archipelagos of neighborhoods. Just think about Amsterdam. There's some parts of Amsterdam that feel incredibly old and quaint. There's some parts that don't feel old and quaint, right? It's a great thing that cities have different options. So there isn't one particular size. That being said, I'll make two other observations. One of which is that generally the economists push back on the idea of trying to micromanage how spaces grow. That sort of there's a lot of magic in the accidental growth of urban spaces and the accidental adding on of neighborhoods. Secondly, when you think about optimal size, right, even though there's not one optimal size, you do want to still think of a framework in the back of your head that measures the positive benefits of urban growth, what we call agglomeration benefits, which are partially about wages, partially about the fact that typically when city size doubles, earnings go up by 6 to 8% in the US, more than that in the developing world, a little bit less than that in Central Europe, and the negative effects of urbanization, like added traffic congestion, contagious disease, crime, and other downsides of density. So you want to be weighing off those upsides against those downsides in terms of thinking what the optimal city size could be. I will say that when you think about those downsides of density, almost all of them can be handled if the government is sufficiently competent, right? So there are many downsides of living in a developing world city that, would never occur to you in Amsterdam because your government is pretty competent, right? So the whole threat of getting cholera, for example, I don't know the last time you worried about cholera in Amsterdam, but you did at one point in time, but you haven't probably for 150 years, right? That reflects a triumph of the public sector, right? Your traffic congestion problems are much more modest relative to cities where people don't bike everywhere, that haven't done relatively sensible things in terms of traffic management. All of those things make the density of Amsterdam more of a pleasure than a hindrance. Right? Whereas, if you live in a city with a much more poorly functioning public sector, the downsides, the demons that come with density become more problematic.
Another question over there. Linus, yeah. The left one on the left.
Hi. What factors, other than education, can foster this diversity that you explain is so good for cities?
So you want to think about it. I mean, entrepreneurship is very good, okay, but it's harder to engineer entrepreneurship. I mean, I often tell cities that the right development strategy is to attract and train smart people, and then more or less get out of their way, right? That's the best we can do. Now, attracting smart people, it does not mean laissez-faire. As I just suggested, right, making a city that's safe, that's fun, that's fast-moving, all of that requires an effective public sector. Attracting and training smart people is not trivial. But in terms of making cities entrepreneurial, making them diverse, it's hard. I mean, we know some things not to do. So don't bet everything on attracting one big employer, which is something that cities often do that's narrow. Two, think a lot about the barriers to entrepreneurship in your city. To what extent, particularly regulatory barriers. So, and in the US at least, it's practically criminal, the way that we make it so much harder to be a poor entrepreneur, meaning a poor person engage in poor people's entrepreneurship, than engage in rich people's entrepreneurship. So if you want to start your internet phenomenon, right, you can start it in a Harvard dorm room, and by the time the regulators start paying attention, you have 1 billion users for your app, right? And then finally they may decide that you've hacked an election and they want to bring you to Washington. But really, it goes on for years before anyone's paid any attention to you. Whereas if you wanted to start a grocery store that sells milk products in a poor neighborhood in Boston, you literally have 17 permits to get beforehand. That's an outrageously disparate impact. So, making sure it's easy, particularly for poorer urbanites, to start their own businesses is, really the best thing that we can do to make sure that we have a bit more diversity and more entrepreneurship in the city.
Thank you for your question. You wrote about the triumph of the city and you advocate the triumph of the city. However, you yourself moved to the suburbs in 2006. Why did it happen?
I have I'm not the sole decision maker in my family. And I wanted to study suburban hostility to new development at first hand. No, it's the only point that my answer is truthful. In fact, the answer that I gave. The home that I live looks remarkably like my wife's home did when she was growing up, and nothing like mine. That being said, you know, it's a perfectly pleasant place to live, and it's very quiet. Which are, you know, and in fact, noise pollution is a downside of living in cities. So, you know, getting good windows is worth something. You know, different people need different things. And again, I'm not a lifestyle advocate. You know, you may decide that it's actually right for you to live in the country. But what I care about is whether or not we have public policies that artificially restrict the growth of cities. So in the case of the US, we do too much to subsidize highways, for example, that enable people to leave cities and live in far-flung suburbs. We, you know, subsidize home ownership. I mean, the Dutch housing situation is quite complicated, particularly the large role that social housing plays in the rental sector. But in the US, there's a very strong correlation between structure type and ownership type. More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied. More than 85% of multifamily units are rented. So when you say, look, the American dream means home ownership, it means you're trying to push people out of urban apartments into suburban homes. And I see little upside for that. And I will say, within the Dutch housing sector, my biggest concern when I look at Dutch housing sector is the lack of development of a private rental market. In fact, the small size and the high cost of private rental units it troubles me in terms of the Netherlands. And the third thing in the US, which is not true here, is the problem of our urban public schools, which induces so many parents to leave cities to go to suburban school districts to get better schools for their kids. And again, I don't want to artificially boost the size of cities. I don't want to tell anyone who wants to live in a low-density dwelling that they should live in a low-density dwelling. I just want policies that create a level playing field between cities and non-urban spaces.
Your book has been given the critique that given the policies that you recommend, the political feasibility of these policies lack. How would you respond to such criticism?
It's entirely true, and it's absolutely not just the right, but the duty of the academic who gets involved in public discourse to say things that are politically infeasible at this point in time, right? We know that politicians are not going to say things that are deemed to be currently infeasible. So who else is going to say it than people who aren't running for office, right? I don't care if 80% of the people in an audience don't like me. I mean, I hope more of you do, but it's, you know, I don't need your votes in order to retain my job. So it's your job as an academic, it's your job as someone who's outside the political process to push the envelope, to suggest things that aren't going to work. To, you know, for example, you know, one thing that you know, it's not my idea, but it's one that I've fervently advocated: congestion pricing, charging drivers for the costs that they impose on other drivers through congestion and also through pollution. Having things like electronic road pricing, as in Singapore, you could do it based on GPS systems. That's never going to be popular, right? But it's still good policy, and it, you know, given that the politicians are going to be skittish about doing it, it's our job to do it. It just so happens, you know, Singapore has it, London has it, Oslo has it, Sweden has it. None of that would have happened unless Bill Vickery 50 years ago had said, you know what, I'm going to champion an unpopular idea, right? So I believe very fervently it is all of our jobs, all of us who aren't seeking to be elected in office, to actually say things that won't win us election, as long as we think that they're right.
You mentioned London. Now we see that London is 50% more productive per capita than the rest of the UK. Do the benefits of being surrounded by smart people also work the other way around, that productivity decreases in rural areas as smarter people move to cities?
Well, you know, brain drain can be a real thing. So there are two offsetting effects. So when you're thinking about the developing world, there's a bit of that, but the first order effect is just you're sharing land, and when you have more land per farmer, that's good for the poor farmers, right? So one of the great benefits of urbanization in the poorest parts of, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa is you're leaving more land for the people who are left behind. So it is true that they may lose a bit in terms of creative interactions, but, you know, the first order benefit is in terms of land. Now, in terms of depopulation of, you know, declining regions of the US, you know, which are not typically rural, but, you know, formerly successful areas, yeah, this is a big issue. This is a big issue, is the fact that you have, you know, many of the most successful people actually leaving. And there's very strongly directed out-migration, meaning that the sort of, you know, most skilled people have left those areas.
So you could say that it's a zero-sum game then?
I don't think it is zero sum as a whole, but just that there are winners and losers. So it's not. I think the winners offset the losers, but it's important that we make sure we take care of, and in general, having people move to urban areas if they want to is something that I think everybody benefits from. I mean, inventions come out from urban areas which end up benefiting rural areas as well. But we do need to pay attention to those areas that are left behind. And we need to pay attention to them in smart ways, which usually means investing in their own kids, rather than in stupid ways, which means building stupid infrastructure in the vain hope that you're going to bring back some declining region.
Do you think that polarization creates polarization as well?
It's hard to look at the recent American election and not think that that can happen, unquestionably. It's also true, though, that there has been in terms of, I'll just speak in terms of the US election, that it's, I think, as much about values as it is about economics. And it is really important in terms of political discourse, even if living in a city changes your values, to make sure you're listening to the values of people who are not living in a city and giving respect to them as well, even if you don't necessarily disagree with them. Because a non-trivial problem in the US is that sort of the values of the urban coasts, right, become not just their values, but their values that they expect everyone universally to share. And if you walk around thinking that everyone's going to share your values 100%, and that if they don't, they are somehow or other beneath you, you know what? They're going to resent it. And they may well end up electing somebody you don't like very much because of their resentment of you. So, I personally tend to believe very strongly in the values of values of the city, the values that I often associate with 17th century Amsterdam.
Such as?
Such as ethnic diversity, acceptance of it. I mean, this is one of my favorite stories in the history of New York, that Peter Stuyvesant, who was somewhat religiously strong, wanted to expel Jews from New Amsterdam, right? His bosses in the West India Company told him that he was under no circumstance allowed to do this, not necessarily because they loved Jews as people, but because they thought the Jews were good for business, and they weren't going to sacrifice profits in order to, abet religious bigotry, right? Cities push towards that, not necessarily because cities are full of good people, but because when there are opportunities for trade, they push against, various forms of bigotry. So those are values, I think, that come naturally out of commercial cities, and they're values certainly that I share.
The value ethnic diversity within cities, we see a lot of segregation within cities that kind of offsets the cultural diversity that every person in the city can take away from it. To what extent does the city promote segregation? To what extent does this create a bubble in human capital where people with high human capital kind of group together, and that the people with lower human capital don't benefit from the city itself?
Yes. So, when you get segregation, you lose many of the benefits of the city. A child growing up in a highly segregated neighborhood surrounded entirely with people of poverty, it may well be as if it's the same as if he had grown up in some isolated rural area. So the question is, what should public policies do about this? The first order is just to make sure you're not enacting public policies that make it worse. So often public housing projects act to specifically segregate the poor, right? Perhaps they were well-meaning, perhaps they were not, but when you build large towers full entirely of poor people on land that's moved away from the city center, whether or not it's, City of God outside of Rio or the public housing projects of Harlem in New York, you're doing the same, and that's my Harlem, not your Harlem. Those things are creating artificial segregation. Then, if you want to push against segregation, if you get rid of those projects, the next question is, what added things do you want to do? And one of the things we've seen is that well-directed housing vouchers can induce poorer people with kids to move into richer neighborhoods, and that may be a policy you want to, and certainly if you have housing vouchers, just to be clear, right, housing vouchers are public housing support that's given to poorer people. The most famous piece of academic work on this is the Moving to Opportunity experiment, in which people were randomized to have one of three different types of vouchers, one just generic voucher, one voucher that pushed you to move to a low poverty area, and one group got nothing. And the work of Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and particularly Larry Katz over the last 20 years in this has shown that the kids who were given the vouchers that pushed you to move out of poverty ended up being substantially more successful as adults. Very much showing this advantage of integration, but also suggesting, look, if you've got vouchers, then use them to push parents into lower poverty neighborhoods. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to fight it.
But then here again, the question is, what is the political feasibility of these vouchers? Do you see a world wherein these vouchers would be implemented?
You have a lot of public housing projects as it currently stands. So, and if I were talking about this in the Netherlands, we might think about, the housing associations, which are a very large share of the rental housing stock within Amsterdam. Are they doing everything they could be in terms of promoting integration relative to not promoting integration? So I would certainly, rather than worrying about a US solution, so in the case of a US solution, we have housing vouchers, right? The right thing to do is to make sure that they're more targeted towards parents with kids rather than to families without kids, because it's with the kids that you see the biggest advantages of this. In the case of the Netherlands, you have these housing associations. They're a huge fraction of your rental stock in Amsterdam. So the place to start is, how can you think about designing or changing or improving these housing associations in such a way that it does more to promote integration? And I'm not here to say what I think the right answer is. That's a job for you. But that would be, start with the institutions that you have, and then move forward. So, but then again, I also would just say, there comes a time when you have to be realistic, right? When you're actually getting on the cusp of legislation, you actually have to make deals and be pragmatic. But when you're throwing out ideas, forget the realism of it politically. Follow your dreams, do what you think is right, and then finally, at the end of don't compromise until you're close to actually getting a deal. Right? It's start with the bolder vision.
I would certainly like to go back to the divide between the countryside and between urban areas, because I was wondering, you especially in Holland, you can see a divide between voting more progressive and voting more conservative. How can you explain this divide?
Well, often, so there are. So there are many things that are associated with political divisions in different parts of the country. Sometimes, in fact, the divisions cleave sharply along rural-urban tastes. Sometimes they don't. Cultural values do tend to be different. Rural areas do tend to be more conservative culturally than urban areas. Sometimes more religious as well. Sometimes they are, urban areas are more prone to celebrate different types of diversity than rural areas are. But then, of course, it also depends upon the way the political equilibrium works out. Right? Parties can divide upon different things, and if the party cleavages are sharply on rich versus poor, that may not separate on rural-urban at all. That may be some other division. So I think it depends a lot in the way the politics works out in the particular area. And I think more generally, it's just it's just really important to not let those cleavages become too sharp. In the case of the progressives, many of the push for larger government came specifically because of cities need more government, because cities have more problems that demand a stronger public sector. And I think that's one of the reasons why cities naturally became the home of, let's say, the progressive movement in 19th century U.S.
Do you agree with this?
That cities
should need larger governments?
Cities need more government than rural areas do. Do they need more government than they currently have? That depends upon which city we're talking about. But do you require more government in a city than you do in a rural area? Yes, of course, because you require somebody to handle your sewers and your water, and somebody to deal with the public transportation, and somebody to deal with contagious disease, right? An abundance of land hides many sins, right? But when people are brought together, those downsides become very obvious, and you need a public sector to manage it. Or did you mean that I think the cities need more public sector than they currently have?
Well, either one of the two.
So that it depends, right? And it's a question of which public sectors we mean. So when we think about many of the cities of the developing world, you bet they need better public sectors. They need more and better in lots of areas. Particularly, they need better functioning water, better functioning public transit, better functioning public health systems. They probably need less regulation. Most cities, or at least less non-health related regulations in most areas. And that would be true, I think, in terms of, Boston as well, that there are better things Boston can be doing in terms of managing transportation, but they probably need to regulate, let's say, the entrepreneurship of poorer people less.
You talked about making cities can make you smarter and make you happier, but you also talked about how they can make us more environmentally friendly. How can they do that?
So that's a great point, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So it's often depicted as if cities are the arch enemy of the environment. That you used to have this pristine area, and then all of a sudden they came in and they built the skyscrapers, and isn't it terrible? There's this book that I grew up on by Dr. Seuss. Do you have Dr. Seuss in the Netherlands?
I don't think so.
Okay, so there's a guy called the Lorax. The Lorax tells a story of this, and I think that's actually the opposite of what's true. And I like to tell this story either with statistics or with a story about Henry David Thoreau. Do you know who Henry David Thoreau is? So Henry David Thoreau is the secular saint of American environmentalism. And he teaches what a great thing it is to live surrounded by nature. Well, a little known fact about Henry David Thoreau is he personally burned down more than 400 acres of natural woodland, okay? He destroyed a whole ecosystem out not so far away from where I live. And the reason for this is he was cooking, living in the middle of the woods. He was doing some cooking, and of course, the fire started and it spread, and by the time it was done, it had burned down a whole forest, okay? Now, there's a lesson from this, which is if you love nature, you should stay away from it. As indeed, nature will do much better if you're not there starting fires in the middle of the forest, okay? Now, the reason why this works out statistically is that, if you think about carbon emissions, we do a lot less of it when we live in small apartments and when we ride our bicycles to work. Low-density dwellings around trees, means that you're almost invariably living in larger homes, okay? And because the price of space is lower, which requires more home heating and more home cooling, and you're almost assuredly driving, okay? So the places that look green are actually brown, and the places that look brown are green.
Given that cities make us more environmentally friendly, can urbanization be the main method in which we can sustainably hold the increase in population growth?
I think it's part of it. I mean, one way to see this is that the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions rise to that seen in the sprawling United States. Global carbon emissions go up by 130%. If they stop at the level seen at wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%. Right? Now, that's not a solution, but certainly a more compact India and China have a lot to offer the planet in terms of not seeing their carbon emissions go up. Now, with urbanization comes wealth, and that will mean that you'll have some significant increase in carbon as well, but none of us can possibly think that we want India and China to stay poor. Right? That couldn't possibly be the right answer. But a somewhat more compact India and China where they ride the bicycles to work like you do, right? Rather than an India and China where they drive 30 minutes in a car each day, that's something devoutly to be wished.
Is there a role for the developed world to ensure this high density?
Ensure no, but we can help.
In what
right?
ways?
So one of the ways is that, I only speak for America on such things, but in the case of the US, we can try and fight against those rules that artificially inflate sprawl, right? We can do more that, like subsidizing highways, like making it free to, rules that, do things that like involves things like carbon taxes, which I support, which, even if it's not global, and global would be best, it still sets a better example in terms of developing world movement on this. So,
thank you for this interesting answer. I would like to turn to the audience again for an audience question. Is there an audience question?
This guy with a beard had his hand up for a
Is
long
Mr.
time.
here?
He was the first guy. Who was here, yeah.
Thank you. So, in a paper you wrote in 2017, you argue that urbanization plays an important role in democratization, that when cities become more urbanized, it is easier to organize public action, and as a result, democratization becomes easier. What are the public policies you envision, or the changes to cities that can be made in the developing world that can make sure that cities become more of a hub for democracy?
Boy, that's a great question. And this is more, I call it the Boston hypothesis, but it really could be called the Amsterdam hypothesis, right? And the Boston hypothesis because of the role that connections in Boston played in fomenting the American Revolution, of this friendship between Sam Adams and John Hancock. But really, the story is best told from this vantage point. Right, if we think about where republicanism comes from in Europe, right, it starts not quite here, maybe let's go a little bit south to Bruges, in 1204, when the Weavers Guild and the Butchers Guild under de Koninck and others organized and destroyed the flower of French nobility at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1204. Right, this is where urbanites organized. Right, they connected and they said, we're not going to have kings. Well, it took you 80 years here to get rid of your Habsburg overlords, but it came out of, you walk around and you see, for example, the exhibit at the Hermitage Museum, which has all of these pictures of the voluntary associations in Amsterdam in the 16th century, right? That social capital, those friendships, those artillery groups, right, were the organization that made possible the fight to defeat the Spanish. Right? This is where urbanization creates democracy. It organizes, it creates a sense of sort of common values, And then that organization enables groups to come together and to create republics. And the American Declaration of Independence is based very much on a Dutch model from 200 years earlier almost. So in the developing world, we often hear pushback and say, no, look, you shouldn't allow urbanization because the governments are so weak, they're not going to be able to handle the downsides of density at all. Well, where does good government come from? It's not going to come from maintaining a rural absolutism, right? It's going to come from developing the habits of urbanism, that are going to lead to something. So I think the most important things are policies that enable people to speak freely with one another. So if you ask me sort of what the most important thing, I wouldn't be arguing for congestion pricing, although I'm always for congestion pricing. I'd be arguing for, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, a failure to repress, or, just basic things along those levels. And of course, education, because education is crucial in terms of creating the skills that lead to democracy.
You mentioned developing countries, and now we see that in developing countries, the traditional push and pull forces that drive urbanization do not seem to apply to these countries. What are the key differences between urbanization in the developed world and the developing world?
So you're exactly right. So in some sense, the cities of the West only became large when agricultural productivity was pretty large, and agricultural productivity then led to demand for industrial products that were provided in the cities. So that's our basic model of the West. So you have wealth going up, demand for industrial products, and a whole bunch of innovations in the Industrial Revolution that enabled people to start specializing in cities. Developing world, in fact, increasingly it's low levels of agricultural productivity that lead to urbanization. And the difference is globalization. The difference is whereas America needed to feed its own urbanites in 1920, and remember, it didn't become 50% urbanized. America didn't become 50% urbanized until 1920, which had per capita incomes of about $7,500 in modern dollars. Right? Today we see 50% urbanization in the poorest parts of Africa, with per capita incomes under $2,000 in some areas. So much poorer places. That's because you can feed these places with food provided elsewhere. Right? That's because Haiti can be fed not with domestic food, but with food coming in from New Orleans, rice being shipped in from Louisiana. So the globalization means that you de-link the need to have agricultural productivity, and then that means that places that are bad at agriculture get out of agriculture. And that's what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, is that places that are really bad at producing agricultural produce, people are coming to the cities and living off the scraps of natural resources or public largesse of a variety of different forms.
Given these differences in causes, to what extent can we then apply the body of knowledge that we have accumulated on urban economics to these developing countries?
We need to be careful. Some things are the same and some things are different.
Could
right?
you
So
give some
for
examples?
example, the sources of productivity are quite different. So when you try and understand urban economies, right, choose your period. Well, I mean, the Netherlands was the richest place in Europe, right, in the 1600s. So, it's richer. The Netherlands in the 1600s, when urbanization is occurring, is actually richer than much of sub-Saharan Africa right now. But maybe it's equivalent to Lusaka, right, in Zambia. But looking at the economic lessons of the Netherlands from 1650 and applying them to Lusaka would be madness, right? Everything about the economy is different between those two areas. But I'll give you an example which is very natural. So the last mile problem in terms of doing sewers. So today in Zambia, right, it's true in many developing world areas, well-meaning groups like the UN, the Millennium Development Accounts, build water mains, build sewage pipes, right, but they don't connect to the households. They say the households need to pay for the connections, and they're surprised when poor households aren't willing to pay for those connections, which cost $1,000 in a country where per capita GDP is maybe $1,500, right? If they had known any history, they would have realized that this happened in our own countries in the 1800s as well. So I was told a story in New York about how New York had been a filthy place until the engineers came in and built the Croton Aqueduct, which brought in the clean waters, and then a sewage system brought filthy water out, and this made New York clean. That's part of the story, but if you just looked at the death data, you'd notice that New York has continued to suffer from cholera epidemics for 25 years after the Croton Aqueduct was built, precisely because New York had exactly the same last mile problem as Africa does today, that you built the water mains, you expected poor people to connect, you charged them a bunch of money to do so, and they said, no thank you, we'll stick with our shallow wells, we'll stick with our pit latrines. Right? Because they're poor and because these things are expensive. It wasn't until you actually had the Board of Health, which required property owners to actually connect to the sewage pipes that you actually solved this problem. And it wasn't required until you had actually a system that imposed rules. And you had to realize that those rules were going to be necessary, and then think about how you were going to implement those rules in the developing world if you expected those water pipes to do any good.
The UN has projected that 90% of urbanization will come from less developed countries. What do you think the role of urbanization and cities can be in this catch-up race?
Oh, I think it's everything. I think you know, and it's such a problem because so much of the research of urban economics is focused on the wealthy world, right? And so much of the research of development economists is focused on farms, and yet the future of the developing world is urban. The most exciting things that are happening in cities are happening in the developing world today, and the most exciting things in the developing world are happening in cities, and we have this knowledge mismatch. The most important answer, I think, about this is that fixing the cities of the developing world, making them better, is one of the great vocations of the 21st century. And for everyone who's under 30 in this room, just think about those possibilities. I mean, those cities are amazing places. They need help, but they're also offering unbelievable upsides. And getting involved, getting engaged is just incredibly fulfilling and interesting and important thing to do. So I think that's my most important lesson on this. I think
You say that cities are everything for the developing world. However, Professor Rodriguez Posey at London School of Economics found that although urban density and economic growth correlate in the Western world, they do not correlate in the developing world. To what extent is the triumph of the city then only a Western phenomenon?
So to the extent to which we have, I mean, so I've done urbanization and, so there are different ways of looking at this. Urbanization and growth across countries. Urbanization in 1960, if you look at poorer countries in 1960, is incredibly strongly correlated with growth over the next 50 years. Obviously, it's strongly correlated with income and health. You compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized. The more urbanized countries earn on average 5 times higher income and have infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. If you look within countries, if you actually look at decent data on this, India, China, Brazil, all of them have relationships between density or agglomeration and income that are at least as high as those in the United States, and typically correlations with education that are even stronger. Now, it is true that there are some cities, particularly those cities in, there are some cities in sub-Saharan Africa, there are other cities that are largely political, that are less productive, okay? But those areas have rural areas that are also a disaster as well. So it's not as if there's any future in rural poverty, right? The question is how to make those cities that aren't doing what they should be doing more productive, more livable, not that in some sense we should be artificially constraining their growth.
Is the future for these cities then also small establishments like we would expect in the developed world? Or is there a larger role for multinational organizations since these have an imposed structure that can omit corruption, for instance?
Boy, that's a fantastic question. And it's in some sense the hardest question. So I often make the point that in the wealthy world, and I feel very comfortable with this, that successful cities at the start of the 21st century, just like successful cities at the start of the 19th century, have 3 things that are important. Smart people, small firms, and connections to the outside world, right? These are the trinity of urban success in the 21st century. Now, in the case of the developing world, how sure are we that small-scale entrepreneurs who get started there can scale up? How many Facebooks do we see that are starting in the developing world as easily? It's harder. It's less obvious, right? I can give you examples. Soichiro Honda started when Japan was a relatively poor place, and he started with a garage. But the number of those cases are smaller. Nonetheless, I will continue to believe in small-scale entrepreneurship in the developing world. But there's a much stronger case to be made that multinationals can bring in necessary skills, necessary infrastructure, as you said, sometimes less corruption. And I don't think we know the right answer to this. I think we need to continue to push on both fronts and continue to learn. But I am less confident in my view that the right answer is about local entrepreneurship in the developing world than I am in the developed world.
Okay.
Before we sadly have to end this interview, I would like to look at the future of urbanization in cities. Because do you believe that there will be a stagnation of urbanization due to digitalization?
So 30 years ago, when I started in this business, the cyber seers, the techno-prophets, were convinced that declining communication costs were going to do to the remaining functions of cities what declining transportation costs had done to the industrial city. right? So the experts in the 1980s were sure that like these remaining functions of cities like finance, for example, which takes advantage of face-to-face contact, or other high idea-oriented sectors, they were all going to be made obsolete by, in those days it was fax machines, but certainly by email and the internet. Now, that hasn't happened at all, right? And it's a remarkable fact that like, when you think about what companies should be able to do long-distance working best, right? Who should be able to do it better than Google? And yet, does Google say just go home and work from home, work remotely? No. They buy the Googleplex. They cram everyone close together. They get rid of walls. They buy 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. Because this is how human beings create, right? And the more complicated the world is, the more important it is to be face-to-face. Okay, so this is what we've seen over the last 30 years. I don't see how that changes with digitalization. I think that what improvements in information technology are going to do is they're only going to increase the urban imperative. And I think the particular challenge is about the future of work and less skilled people. So when I think about sort of less skilled people who aren't likely to be at the peak of the digital world, what is it that those people are going to do in the 21st century? And I'm hardly the only person who's obsessed with the future of work. I see little future in routine manufacturing. There may be some skills, some roles in very bespoke products that involve manufacturing, but for most of the less skilled people, perhaps for the most people, it's going to be in services. It's going to be in things that involve face-to-face contact, things that involve being nice to each other, right? Things that involve, things that cities are good at, and they're very hard to do outside of cities.
But with certain technologies, we don't need the face-to-face technology anymore.
But we always like it, don't we? If it's good, if it's someone who's smiling and being pleasant to you and actually making the experience desirable, I mean, we've evolved over millions of years to like that. So it's not that you can't do it efficiently with just a thing, but you still can provide a higher end experience with a human being there if the human being can actually be nice to you.
But new technologies like augmented reality, for instance, where I can put on glasses and then you would still sit here and we could still smile and have face-to-face contact and still read your body language. To what extent does these technologies then take away the actual social aspect?
So I think about, I did this online course, which is all free, called Cities X, which is on the Harvard X platform, where there's a YouTube channel. And we imagine the future of the city, and we do have this person who's looking at an augmented reality TV thing. But then we pan out, and she's holding the hands of her partner in an urban space. And I think ultimately, connecting in cyberspace is never going to compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile, right? I mean, we've evolved for this. We're meant to be in the same room. So it might eliminate a little bit of it, but I have trouble thinking that it's really going to kill the pleasures of being together. Now, that is a challenge, actually, right? So it means that people who aren't good at being nice are going to have trouble surviving in this service-oriented world, which is a challenge for like 51-year-old men who are really good, like me, who are really not good at being nice to people. So I take this as a lesson that the future for me and for people like me involves actually learning how to be pleasant to other human beings. But
so we will never discuss the future of the triumph of the countryside.
Well, countrysides have their role as well, right? I mean, we all like a little bit of that as well, and there's heterogeneity of tastes. And I think the view is that a countryside can be magnificent even if lots of people don't live in it. I mean, when all of you think about what you value in a countryside or the Dutch countryside, does that get better when more people live in that area, or worse when more people get in that area? I think most of us, when we imagine the triumph of the countryside, we imagine one farmhouse surrounded by a lot of greenery. That's a triumphant countryside. So I don't see any reason why we can't deliver that. Right? And why we won't deliver more of that when more people live in the city. And in fact, in some sense, the triumphant city is the triumphant countryside.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Glaeser, thank you for the interview. Sadly, our time is up. Before I want a warm round of applause for our guest, I would like a warm round of applause for our guest, I just want to announce that our next guest here at the Room for Discussion stage will be Dick Boer, CEO of Ahold Delhaize. Which will be interviewed on the future of the retail sector, the 7th of June, 1 o'clock here in the Routes E-hall. And now, please, a warm round of applause for Professor Edward Glaeser.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, too. I'm really very grateful. Thank you.